Sorry about that. Off to an auspicious start. Thanks for having me, and thanks for placing me right in the slot where my jet lag is really kicking in the most. But I'll do my best to try and stay awake and keep you awake, and talk through some of the practicalities of getting into the canning of wine. Just a quick survey so I understand my audience. How many of you out there are already canning wine at this point? Okay, one for sure. And I assume the rest of you are interested in canning wine? All right, so that tells me to start simple and give you guys some good groundwork so that you can make the right decisions as you go down on this adventure. Robert talked a little bit about the practicality of aluminum cans. I think my favorite statistic is the recyclability statistic. Not just that aluminum is infinitely recyclable, but that people tend to recycle cans more than they do bottles. In fact, if you look at recycling statistics, 70 to 80%, depending on where you are in the world, of aluminum does get recycled, of aluminum cans do get recycled, whereas 70 to 80% of bottles, whether they're plastic bottles or glass bottles, do not get recycled. So there's even a tendency to actually ensure that aluminum does get recycled. So it's another good reason to get into this business, not to mention some of the things that Robert also touched on with regards to the marketing, right? You have a 360-degree billboard, if you will, on each can, a real opportunity to be able to show off what your brand is and what your product is. And then when you multiply that by, for instance, a six-pack, you've kind of got three faces to a can of wine that are on the shelf that can really help to make your brand stand out. So getting into just the simple steps of a canning line. Obviously, it all starts with the empty cans themselves, and we'll talk a little bit more about cans and the technology behind them. First thing you want to do is ensure that those cans are clean. You want to then, as they go through the filler, get rid of any oxygen that's in the can. You want to fill them. You want to seal them. And then post-fill, you want to go down and do an inspection to ensure that they're full. You want to essentially rinse and dry them so that you can prepare them for printing and labeling, and then put them in their final package and ready to go out to the shelves. So we'll walk through some of these steps in a little bit more detail. Robert talked about the can. Really the breakthrough and the difference between what the French were getting in World War I and what we're drinking today is that the development of the liner for the can has come a long ways. There's a lot of work that's been put into essentially putting the liner in the can. If you were to literally take a can, and you can go watch YouTube videos on this, you can scratch off the paint and you can essentially melt the aluminum on the can, and you'll get left with what you see here on the left. There's a polymer liner that is sprayed into the can body that essentially gives you a protective barrier between the aluminum and the contents of the can so that you don't get any kind of interaction between the two. No scalping, no staling, no ingress of oxygen, or any of, or just as importantly, any of the elements of your beverage leaking out and being leached out by the aluminum. So it creates a very impermeable barrier. And so, as I mentioned, the can gets sprayed. The lids as well, which get put on, and we'll walk through the process here, they also have that coating sprayed on them. It's a little bit different process there. They actually spray the layer on prior to stamping the lids so that when you pull those lids out, everyone has it. So that liner technology has made all the difference in not just in canning of wine, but in canning of beverages in general. And this is really what started the kickoff of the craft beer world about 15, 20 years ago, was that they had perfected that liner. And it is easier to make a liner to make beer work in a can than it is wine, but they've perfected that as well. And I would encourage you, if you're getting into canning wine, work closely with your can suppliers to ensure that the liner that you're getting in that can is made for the product that you're going to be putting in there. They do an awful lot of research specifically around making the liner work with the specific beverage that we put in the can. So let's talk about how we source cans and where we get them from. I'm going to go through a few different options here. The first is that you go and buy blanks, okay? Either the shiny silver can or a white painted can, and you buy them in bulk from a company such as Ball or Crown or Ardagh. This is a bit of a challenge for a small startup because your minimum order quantity is going to be at least that many that fit in a truck with a trailer. And Ball, in fact, just announced last week in the United States that their minimum order is going up to over the equivalent of 1 million cans, or 5 truckloads of cans if you're ordering it directly from Ball. I expect that Crown and some of the other ones will follow that lead, which basically means that the small guys, all the craft brewers and the small wineries, et cetera, are not going to be able to buy their cans directly from the manufacturer. They're going to have to buy them through an intermediary, and I'm going to talk about some of those. Ball and the large guys, they also offer, if you're able to buy at those volumes, a printed can, which is printed just like a T-shirt, if you will, with offset printing. And so it basically they build the templates and off they go. Again, very large minimum order quantities, because when they're not producing cans, they're not making money, and it's a long changeover with an offset printing process for them to move from one can design to another can design. So, and I have no idea why this graphic is in the middle of my slide, but let's just ignore the graphic and look at the cans behind it. But these are pressure-sensitive labels, which you design with the label provider, and you buy them essentially on a roll, and you have your own can label applicator as part of your canning line. And the benefits of this are, first of all, you get a lot of input into the design of the actual label. And you also basically can switch over the labels very quickly. So you can do very small batch sizes. If you want to move from canning one SKU to another SKU, it's as simple as going down the line to your printer or your label applicator, popping that label off, feeding the next label, and away you go. So an awful lot of control. You're the one who controls the batch size when it comes to what's in the actual product. Next would be shrink sleeves. Again, these shrink sleeve cans can come from an intermediary. So they buy volume from the Balls and the Crowns of the world. They work with you on the design of your sleeve, and then they essentially pre-shrink sleeve the empty cans and provide those to you in whatever batch sizes that you want to take them in. Typical minimum batch size on a shrink sleeve would be at least 1 pallet of cans, okay? Some of them are more. So it's a great way to be able. The nice thing about shrink sleeve designs, as you can see, the design goes up past the neck, okay? Whereas the pressure-sensitive labels stop before the neck. So you get a little bit more real estate, if you will, to be able to put your design on the can. One of the negatives of doing shrink sleeves is that these sleeves are not recyclable. You either end up melting them off during the recycling process, or in a lot of cases, they actually have passed some laws, for instance, in the province of Quebec in Canada, they won't accept recycling aluminum if it has shrink sleeve labels on it, because up to 10% of their volume can actually be plastic instead of aluminum. So there are some environmental and recycling aspects to shrink sleeves that don't make them very popular in some areas. And then last, and this is an emerging market with the cans, is digital printing. So this is where they literally inkjet or spray the color right onto the can. These are great because you can literally get down to a batch size, if you will, of 1 can. You can print 1 can after another, and every one can be different. The challenge here is that you're not going to be able to afford your own digital printer because these start around $2 million. So you'll be working with an intermediary who's printing these cans out. And obviously, they're trying to offset the cost of these printers. So they're going to be a few more cents per can than if you go the shrink sleeve route or if you go with the pressure-sensitive label. But they're beautiful, beautiful cans and very, very powerful marketing tool. And you can get them quickly. So now that we've talked a little bit about the cans, let's talk about how we get those cans to our essentially to our filler. And this is a different sequence, by the way, than the way you would think about setting up your canning line. Most people, when they're buying the equipment for their canning line, they start by thinking about the filler and then work their way upstream on the dry side and downstream on the wet side. But because we're going down the line, we'll talk about depalletizers here real quick. So this is our smallest depalletizer. Just a quick advertisement about Ska Fabricating. We started in the craft brewing industry back in 2012. We have about 3,000 customers worldwide. We focus primarily on depalletizers, and then we also help to do line design, so we can essentially sit down with you and work through your line design for what's upstream and downstream of the depalletizer and the seamer. But this is our smallest depal. This is when it's folded down. It's almost the same footprint as a pallet. You can set it away in a small space, and all you need is your pump jack, your pallet jack, to be able to essentially pick this up and put it in place. When it's in place for your canning session, this is what it looks like on the left of your picture here. And just walking down the line here, you can see that there's a half a pallet of cans in there. It's pushing them onto that circular part there. They're coming down through the rinse cage where you see that stainless steel hood. That's where the rinse is happening. So the cans have been inverted upside down, sprayed with water in this case, allowed to dry for a second, and then flipped back up and brought down into the filler that you see on the right-hand side here. This is a water example. You can also do ionized air. It's very popular in areas where you don't trust the water, or you don't want even small drops of water to be introduced to your product. The ionized air can work in a hooded situation where you blast the air into the can and you capture the air and anything else that comes out of the can for a full cycle. And as you grow, your canning line can grow. This is an example of a high-speed line. I'm really bad at converting cans per minute to cans per hour, but these will run at about 700 cans per minute, and they have a full pallet infeed system where you just queue up the pallets, and the pallets roll into the machine one after another. And it sweeps off entire layers on the top. I already talked through the rinsing part of it. On your left here is just a standard water rinse. In this case, you can see the drain hose. They just essentially take that and stick it into the drain underneath your canning area. It's as simple as that. On the right-hand side is the ionized air that I mentioned. Now we get to the filling machines. There's a couple of different designs here. I'll talk about what people do when they're starting. It's usually what they call an inline filling machine. These are very popular. They're quite cost-effective. This, by the way, is the exact machine that we have in our booth. I see a lot of you that have already been to our booth, but I encourage you to come by and have a look at the machine in our booth. This is a 5-head filler. It fills 5 cans at a time that are fed from the left here and pushed out to the right. You can go as big as 20 heads. Our partners, Microcan, who have this machine in the booth, have a 10-head version, so it's 5 and 5, 2 lanes. Changing over between can sizes with an inline machine is fairly easy. In this case, I think you can probably switch over this machine between, for instance, a 220 and a 375 in about less than half an hour, probably more like 15 minutes. They have clean-in-place capabilities, which means that when you're switching between different products that you're canning, essentially you can clean the line right in place with the press of a few buttons. That should say 60 to 80 per minute cans, so about 60 to 80 cans per minute is the maximum on these inline machines. And just by doubling the heads, you don't necessarily double the speed because it's not a continuous process. The cans come in the machine, they stop, they get filled, and they move on. So doing that times 10 is not going to make it much faster. Rotary machines, this is the big guys. So plenty of companies out there, most of them German or Italian, that make these large machines. They are a continuous motion machine. They have up to, this one here, for instance, has 132 heads, and they run at very, very high speeds. I don't think that's too much interest for this. A big push in the filling category these days is to move to counter pressure fillers. So the filler that I showed you there, in order to get the oxygen out of the can, essentially there's a lance that goes down and injects either CO2 or nitrogen in the can. It's 3 times heavier than air, so as you put that into the can, it pushes the air out of the top of the can. And then it quickly moves to the next station where you essentially do the fill. But in that process, you're still going to introduce your product to air, which can cause problems. What the counter pressure filler does is keeps the product pressurized while you are all the way through from the decanting process to the filling process. Essentially, using gravity, it will essentially force CO2 in and then force the product in and vent out the CO2, all while the can is essentially capped while it does this. So this is becoming more and more mainstream, these counter pressure fillers. Most of the companies are starting to offer them. It'll be a higher quality product that you put out of your machine due to the fact that it's never exposed to air. just on can seaming, and I know we're getting into some of the practicals, but it's good to understand this stuff. So we talked a little bit about the can and the liner and the lid. This basically is a cross-section of the lid, which is the dark, going on to the can, which is the light here. If you come and see, you can get a good look at it in our booth, but it's a two-step operation. They spin the can, and then they bring a wheel in from one side, which essentially rolls the lid around underneath the can. So it basically starts by peeling the can open a little bit and rolling the lid around it. And then the second process here will actually compress that and make that airtight so that you've got a complete airtight container around your actual product. So this is, once it's filled, it moves down to the seaming step. And believe me, the filler manufacturers put an awful lot of time and effort into working on seaming, and they use that as a differentiator. So it's important to think about the seaming operation when you're going it through the fill. This was supposed to be a video of the same thing, but I'm going to skip it. And I probably shouldn't have done that. Let me just keep on rolling here. Please come back. Yes. All right, so I'm just going to continue here with some typical line layouts, and we'll talk about some of the practicalities of it. If you start small, you may have just a portable line. You don't worry too much about designing the layout ahead of time. You wheel in all the different parts for your filling line. You do your filling run, and then you move everything aside. When you get to the point where you want to put permanent equipment in place, we tend to encourage people to work with us on what the layout will look like that incorporates every piece of your filling line. So this one is basically a U shape. It starts in the top left, goes to the right, and comes back to the bottom left here, where the top left is your depalletizer that takes the cans in. It pushes them up on this drawing onto the single filer, and then goes down through the rinse. That's an inline filler on the top right there. Around the corner there, you've actually got a date coder, and then eventually you move into the labeler, which is right there, and then into pack off. So this is a fairly simple, basic line here. You see that essentially with the filler as kind of our linchpin here, when we know what the speed of the filler is, we design the line so that we never starve the filler. That's why that I'm starving thing was there. I meant to use it in one of the slides and forgot about it. But you never want to starve the filler. The filler should always be continuously running. You never want to stop it. So you want to make sure upstream that you've got the velocity that you need to ensure that the filler never stops. And then if you have stages downstream, and the labeler is a very good example, that are a little bit finicky, or that you have to be able to change over rolls on if you run out of labels on a roll, you need time to do that with the filler never stopping. So you start to build in accumulation into your line. So if you look at the green here, the green is all the conveyance. Just up from the filler, so it's basically the center of your drawing on the lower part there, that's a bidirectional table. So it has can capacity, and the cans can just sit there and spin and wait until the downstream operation, which in this case is the labeler, comes up again and start to process the cans. And of course, the labeler will eventually drain that accumulation and then downstream onto the pack-off operation. So we try and design with accumulation in mind in the places where it's most important, namely upstream of a critical operation. Now this is a big, complex one that probably runs at about 300 to 500 cans per minute here. This one starts in the bottom right and runs out and counterclockwise. At the top of your screen, that's a rotary filler. You come over to the left here, you've got the rinser. You come around, you've got a lot of accumulation there before your cartoning operations. So in this case, they're cartoning the beer. And then eventually you get to the pack-off down in the bottom left-hand corner. So if you think you're going to get to this speed at some point, it's good to be able to ensure that you design your line with the space to be able to do this when you're putting your first line in. And then we can treat each of these components as being something that can be pulled out and replaced with something faster. And you'll probably start with your filler and work your way from there upstream and downstream. So I'm going to talk through some things that you should consider when you're putting your line in. First, has nothing to do with your line. Understand your market. Understand the volumes that you're going to be selling at. Understand any requirements that they have with regards to being able to sell cans in certain regions. There's different countries, different states and provinces have different rules with regards to size of can, what can be on the can. I was a little startled. We do a lot of things besides wine, and one of the things, Canada just about a year ago legalized marijuana, and they do a lot of drinks in cans that have THC in them. They literally have a rule that is countrywide in Canada that the entire can has to be printed in black and white, because they feel like adding any color, and there's even a lot of design limitations, they feel like adding any color may attract children to the can in your refrigerator, and they may actually get into, a THC drink, which would definitely be a bad thing. So that's kind of a drastic example, but there are all sorts of rules as to what you can put on a can. Ensure that you've got adequate can supply. I hope I didn't scare you with the minimum orders from companies like Ball, et cetera. A lot of when you pick your filler, talk to them about where you should get your cans. They'll know because they're working with them. And a lot of fillers have side businesses, by the way, where they do mobile canning. So you don't even have to buy your line. I didn't mention that prior, but you don't even have to buy your line. You can literally go and use mobile canners if you live in a region where they supply the service. They'll bring on the entire canning line, can your product, and be out of there in half an hour or an hour. Am I running over? Okay. Of course, consider budget. Start with what you can afford and then grow it from there. Footprint, you saw some of those layouts. It's important, by the way, this room would be a horrible room for doing canning in for two reasons. One is the ceiling is very low, and two is there's posts everywhere. And the third problem would be if it was a multi-level. So we like to start with nice, big, wide open spaces to be able to put our canning lines in and have some room to be able to grow. And think about ingress and egress of your cans, bringing in your empty cans and getting out your full cans. That's why those lines are designed where the beginning and the end of the canning line are pretty well in the same area, because that's where the traffic flow in and out of the canning area is. And then, of course, think about future growth. And then specifically around canning and some of the golden rules, I mentioned that the filler should never stop. That's very, very true. It's definitely true in the beer world, and it's also true in the wine world. You want to keep that going, because anything that's sitting in a line as opposed to flowing can change in temperature, which throws off all the tuning and adjustments that you've done to your line, because temperature has a big effect on what you put into the can. Think about the flow, as I mentioned, where your cans come in and come out, and then lock in your can supply. And if we've got just a minute, I want to show just a quick video of one of these lines running. I am not a Windows guy, so I'm going to try my best to flip over to, where's the file? There we go. I'm going to show just a quick video here of all this kind of coming together. Oh, with music. So I apologize, it's a bit of an advertisement, but this is what I have available. So here we are, placing a full pallet of cans into a depalletizer, unbanding it, getting the door closed. Notice this canning area here, lots of room around. Once the door is closed, literally they take off the top sheet here. You can also automate that step, but in this case they take it off manually, and they are essentially ready to can. What you see on the right-hand side there is where the cans get pushed onto, and then they get brought down to essentially a single file here. And all these depalletizers, as well as these fillers, they all handle multiple can sizes, both height-wise, volume-wise, as well as the actual can diameter. This is a kombucha line from Rowdy Mermaid, so they're a taller, thinner can. There are some specific changeover things that you need to do, but most lines these days you can accommodate multiple different can formats. There you are, going into an inline filler here. Those are lids in the sleeve there. They come in down through their own applicator, and once the filling step is done, the lids are brought down and put onto the can. And this is your pack off at the other end. This is that's an ionized air rinse there. You can see the vacuum hoses to be able to feed it. That's a 10 head inline. Very simple pack off in this case. They're cartoning themselves and pushing them onto a table and then loading the pallets, which you see them taking away. You would never believe, and this is such a popular brand in the United States, and they make it all in this little tiny warehouse, and you see Rowdy Mermaid everywhere in the U.S. So I hope that helps you understand a little bit more about what a canning line looks like and how to get started in it. As I said, we've got a booth here. You can't miss it, right? You walk in the door, you see the depalletizer sitting there. I encourage you to come over and ask any more questions. I can certainly, I think, take some questions now based on time, or am I over?
Are there any questions still? Otherwise, you can also visit him at the booth and
Yep.
go into details there, because I have to look.
Yeah, we'll get back on track here.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.